I now give the floor to His Excellency Sergei Lavrov, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, last year from this very podium at the anniversary session of the UN General Assembly, a good number of fair assessments were heard at this turning point in the development of the world. The keynote was the acknowledgement of the fact that humanity, in its transition from a bipolar and unipolar world order to objectively developing polycentric and democratic systems of international relations, have faced challenges and threats that are common to us all, that we can only overcome by working jointly together. It was rightly stressed that there is a need to change the very philosophy of interstate communication by excluding attempts to interfere in internal affairs of states or impose development models to countries and nations. Unfortunately, the ideas of mentoring, supremacy, exclusiveness, realization of one's own interest by any means, which have been deeply rooted in the minds of political elites of a number of Western countries, to the detriment of our efforts to promote equitable cooperation. The outcome of arrogant attitudes and feelings of infallibility in pushing forward unilateral and reckless solutions. We see this in the bleeding Middle East and North Africa. As a result, the foundations of world stability are being destroyed. It is high time to learn lessons and prevent a slipping down to catastrophe in Syria. Mainly thanks to Russia's military assistance at the Syrian legitimate government's request, it became possible to prevent the collapse of statehood and disintegration of that country under the onslaught of terrorists. Our engagement provided the impetus to the establishment of the International Syria Support Group with a view to starting a meaningful political process so that the Syrians could determine the future of the country themselves through an inclusive dialogue of all ethnic and religious groups. This course was recorded, to which there is no alternative. It was set down in the UN Security Council resolutions and was embodied in recent agreements between Russia and the United States as co-chairs of the International Syria Support Group. Now it is essential to prevent the disruption of these agreements and to carry out unbiased and impartial investigation of the incidents in Deir ez-Zor and Aleppo that undermine these agreements, especially since there are quite a few people wishing to sabotage these agreements and settlement of conflict in Syria. It is of cardinal importance to fulfill the demands of the UN Security Council to separate the so-called moderate opposition from terrorists, and a particular responsibility in this regard lies with the U.S. and members of the U.S.-led coalition. The Syrian crisis cannot be resolved, and the appalling humanitarian situation cannot be rectified without the suppression of ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and their associated extremist groups. And this is a confrontation against the UN Security Council. We will not be able to have a humanitarian situation which is improved without rooting out the terrorist groups, and this is absolutely important in order to have truces and reconciliation. We need to strengthen and start negotiations without any preconditions in line with 2415 UN resolution. The sabotage of the process with the specific people from abroad with their mentors and supporters has a negative impact on the UN's reputation and leads us to believe that here once again the reason lies in an attempt to try to change the regime. Those who like these zero-sum games, we have seen this in Ukraine, which is very close to us, in the anti-constitutional attempts to overthrow the government, and now the refusal of Ukraine to fulfill the February 2015 Minsk agreement. By and large, trying to use these conflicts for one's own egotistical goals has been clear to all. The last meeting of the contact group give us a very cautious basis for some optimism. Broader, it is only through the honest implementation of all agreements will we be able to have any opportunity in the Euro-Atlantic area to have equal and indivisible security for mutual beneficial cooperation, as was stated in the OSCE almost 20 years ago. Nor NATO nor the EU will be able to substitute a truly collective unification of efforts in everyone's interest without any winners or losers. And it is utterly unacceptable to use sports, for example, to make hostages to political ambitions, which has also always brought people together, strengthened friendship and confidence. Trying to usurp the right to predetermine the outcomes of sporting contests does not honor those who launt their allegiance to fair competition, but in fact are flouting the UNGA-approved principles of independence and autonomy of using sporting competition in this way. In today's world, we cannot use the philosophy of anti-heroes of George Orwell's anti-utopian Animal Farm, where all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. In the enlightened 21st century, it is simply indecent to play mentor to everyone around, reserving the right to this oneself, to use doping or to launch unilateral adventures by bypassing the UN, to conduct geopolitical experiments that cost millions of human lives, or engage in extraterritorial blackmail of all, including one's closest allies, when at play are financial profits for one's own, or even to establish the criteria which deem one country great. This is unworthy of the principles of freedom and equality on which great nations were built and grew, in whose name today their elites threaten the entire world. This year, we will mark the 70th anniversary of the Nuremberg trial decisions. This anniversary cautions us against forgetting the lessons of World War II, reminds us of the catastrophic consequences of attempts to determine the fate of the world by suppressing the legitimate interests of other states and peoples. We cannot use the freedom of expression or peaceful assembly as an excuse for condoning radical movements that profess the Nazi ideology and that glorify Nazis and their accomplices. The persistence of these vicious instincts dictates the need for consistent efforts that can put a solid barrier in the way of neo-Nazism and revanchism, to strengthen inter-ethnic and intercultural agreements and accord, to rally the young generations around the ideas of justice and equality. We invite everyone to take part in the 19th World Festival of Youth and Students in October of next year in Sochi. Hegemonism has no place in the future if you want it to be a future which is just and which would give all peoples the opportunity to choose ways for their own development. This implies the need to learn to respect one's own partners, to respect the cultural and civilizational diversity of the modern world. This means that we need to come back to our origins, the norms and principles enshrined in the UN Charter and other World Organization instruments. Our commitment to that approach was reaffirmed in the Russia-China Declaration on increasing the role of international law signed on June 25th of this year. The observance of the principles of sovereign equality of states, non-interference in internal affairs should become a measure of decency and legitimacy of any member of the world community. If we don't put an end to this type of a philosophy of anything goes, we will not be able to counter international terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and other threats of a transboundary nature. In fighting terrorism, we cannot use double standards. Here, we need true universal pooling of our interests in order to put together a broad counter-terrorism front, as was proposed by President Putin from this stage a year ago. The tragedy of Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria have proven the need to stop opportunistic attempts to use extremists for advancing geopolitical intentions. Before it is too late, we need to think about preventing the proliferation of terrorist and extremist ideology, which literally holds youth hostage in many different regions of the world. We are drafting a UN Security Council resolution in order to mobilize the efforts to eliminate this evil, and looking forward to your support. Besides rooting out radicalism, we could also look at settling of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We need to get it out of the stalemate which we are focusing on at a meeting from the 1st of July of this year, and we're looking forward to the implementation of the recommendations. We're also very worried about the non-proliferation and arms control. It's very important to support strategic stability in all of its components, and some are trying to replace this populist slogans of nuclear zero, so-called. And we see that many countries that have nuclear arsenals are not taking part in these agreements. We're also putting to the test of the non-proliferation treaty. It's put to a serious test. It is harder for parties to find a common language, especially when certain nuclear powers are torpedoing any compromises to start negotiations to establish of a free weapons of mass destruction free zone and means of its delivery in the Middle East. Russia has consistently supported the liberation of humanity from the threat of nuclear weapons and other types of WMD. However, the advancement towards nuclear disarmament must be made with the full consideration of the whole set of factors that affect strategic stability, including the creation of unilateral missile defense systems, the placement of strategic non-nuclear strike weapons, the placement of weapons in outer space, and the inability to ensure the entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, as well as the growing imbalance in the area of conventional arms in Europe. We note the growing support of our initiative to draft an international convention for suppressing the acts of chemical and biological terrorism, the start of serious negotiations on this issue, and on the Russia-China draft treaty on the prevention of the agreement of not placing weapons in outer space could help us move the key body of the UN multilateral disarmament mechanism, the Conference on Disarmament, out of an impasse. We also called for a substantial examination of our proposals on the improvement of the Convention on the Prohibition of Biological and Toxic Weapons. NATO member countries brought the conventional arms control in Europe to a deep deadlock. Our attempts to salvage it faced a tough, ideologically driven counteraction. All ideas to return to this issue now could only be meaningful only if the North Atlantic Alliance would recognize the absolute futility of using ultimatums aimed at achieving unilateral advantages. We continue to be open for an equitable and mutually respectful dialogue with NATO, including through the use of the CSTO. Also, to strengthen stability and ensure equal and indivisible security in other parts of the world it would be very necessary, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. The recent actions by the DPRK that violate UN Security Council resolutions must be halted. We call upon Pyongyang to abandon its nuclear missile program and return to the non-proliferation treaty regime. However, it is inadmissible to use this situation as a pretext for massive militarization of the Northeast Asia and to deploy there another position area for U.S. global missile defense systems. All sides must refrain from further escalation of tensions, to embark on the way towards political and diplomatic settlements of the nuclear problem of the Korean Peninsula through the resumption of six-party talks. We will continue the dialogue within the framework of East Asia Summit on establishing in that area a regional security and cooperation architecture based on non-bloc foundations. A number of participating countries, including Russia, India, China, and Indonesia, have submitted their considerations on this topic. We invite countries of the region to agree on the ways to implement the initiative by President Putin to establish an extended Eurasia partnership with the participation of the Eurasian Economic Union, as well as other members of the CIS, as well as the SCO, ASEAN, and other interested states. I would like to underscore that this initiative is open. It is fully in line with the earlier established plans to create a trade investment bloc between Russia and the European Union, and it will be working on the principles and norms of WTO unlike the projects which use closed trade investment blocs that undermine the unity of global trade systems. We will continue to promote the unification agenda in various international fora within the UN, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the G20. The recent summit in Hangzhou reaffirmed the status of the G20 as a leading global economic and financial forum. And we thank the Chinese chairmanship for their efforts to efficiently use their representative platform to exchange views on the key issues of global economy and policy for subsequent promotions of these agreements in the universal format of the United Nations. The signing of the Paris Agreement on the prevention of climate change has become an important event in the UN activities. The communication of intended nationally determined contributions on a voluntary basis towards achieving the objectives of the agreement to hold the rise of global average temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. Now we need clear procedures and provisions in order for the Paris Agreement to be fully implemented, considering everyone's interests. Now, in this context, it is also important of the Article 6 provision of the emission of greenhouse gases. Now, in this final analysis, this would be of crucial importance to prevent the violations of competitive environments and transfer the polluting industries or dirty production from one country to another, which hampers the achievement of sustainable development goals. The UN was established to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and develop equitable international cooperation. Today, this covers all areas of international life and human communication, from political and military aspects of security and climate protection, conflict settlement, peacekeeping, ensuring human rights and freedoms, sustainable development, and fair regulation of information technology, and to fight terrorism and drug trafficking, to combating corruption, from eradication of infectious diseases, to upholding social responsibility of businesses, and to foster scientific and technological progress. And of course, the UN must promote the dialogues of civilizations to support pluralism, cultures, and traditions, to be catalyst for progress in science and arts. In essence, we are talking about preserving humanity in all of its riches and diversity. And this is the goal that should constitute the basis for our collective efforts and become an imperative for global development and an incentive for improving global governance and the true democratization of international relations. I would like to express our gratitude to His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, who has made enormous efforts at his post of Secretary General of the UN to renew the United Nations with regard to the time constraints. We believe that the new Secretary General, will make it also a very valuable contribution. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation for his statement. And I now